was awesome. Very nice. We haven't done Matisyahu in here before. That was really a nice song. Thanks, guys. So this morning, I want to share with you a quick story. As we think about this idea of salvation as banquet. This is a story I may have told in here before. Some of you may have heard it in different contexts. The story goes way back. We don't know if it's Japanese, Zen, rabbinical, but I heard it from a rabbi actually at a festival many years ago. It went something like this. There was a young boy, probably 6 or 7, maybe that old. He went to his rabbi and he wanted to know, he was a very thoughtful, reflective kid, wanted to know the difference between heaven and hell. He wanted to know what is heaven and what is hell. And so the rabbi said, it's a simple thing. I just need you to sort of go with me, use your imagination a little bit. So he sat him down. He said, close your eyes and just try to visualize what it is I'm about to say. And it didn't have Einstein in it, but it was kind of like this. And he said, I keep forgetting that's what Austin did there. But he said, okay, so hell is like this. He said, now just imagine this. He said, in hell, there's a long, long table. People are seated all around this table. There are people from all around the world. People of every sort are sitting around this table in chairs. And in front of them is all this amazing food. There's just this most delicious food set on platters and plates from all around the world. It's just sitting there. They're hungry. Their mouths watering. It's sitting there. Unfortunately, all of their arms are short and locked, so they can't reach so they have these long forks, like those little long back scratchers, these long forks that are sitting beside the plate. And he said, so you have to use those forks to feed yourself. The problem is, he said, when they reach down and try to feed themselves, in hell, they're trying to feed themselves with these locked arms and these long forks, the food just falls all over the place, and the people starve. And the boy opens his eyes. He says, it's terrible. He says, so what's heaven? The rabbi said, close your eyes, use your imagination. He said, so in heaven, there's this long table, and there are people seated all around it in chairs from everywhere around the world, every sort of person. And in front of them is this amazing, delicious food set on platters and plates. Just looks so good, the most amazing food from all over the place. He said, their mouths are watering, they're hungry. He said, and in heaven, it's unfortunate, they've got these locked arms. They're short, these arms are short, and they're locked at the elbows, and they have these long forks. And the boy says, wait, opens his eyes. He says, Rabbi, you're describing hell. He said, no, I'm describing heaven. He says, heaven and hell are the same place. And the rabbi said, no, close your eyes, I'm not finished. So the boy closed his eyes, and he said, in heaven, they pick up their forks, and when they dip the fork into the food, they reach across the table with their locked arms, and they feed each other. And the boy opened his eyes, smiling. The rabbi said, so do you understand the difference between heaven and hell? And the boy said, yes, the difference is the people. It's kind of a sweet story, and it has a wonderful message, and in a way it seems almost maybe a little cliche. We know the difference, I suppose, is the people. Perhaps what's most radical about it is that as a rabbinical story, it's not about the belief, right? It's about the practice. It's not about the conceptual stuff, it's about the being stuff. It's about being heaven, about being hell. And for some of us, we know all too well what it means to be in heaven and to be in hell. The reality of that experience. But as I got to thinking about this, Linda and I were walking, and Linda said, Tom, it's also how the dinosaurs became extinct. And here's what occurred to me about this. I love this joke. Oh, I got to add this one too because it's just so pitiful. But what's really interesting about this, as funny as that idea is, it occurred to me that that's what we all suffer from. Most of society, most of civilization suffers from this, what I'm just going to call, for lack of a better way of saying it, short arm syndrome. We suffer from this reality, this orientation to life that it's all about trying to take care of myself. And it's literally because we operate, no pun intended, we operate out of a reptilian brain, right? We've talked about that so many times in here. We operate out of some of our most primitive, simplistic ways of relating to things. And so we fall into patterns, and we operate it out of the fear and the anxiety, and we look for comfort. And so we center around this reality that is focused, although we talk about charity, but charity is not the same thing as being. Charity is kindness. Charity is sympathy. But it's not the same thing as being. And that's what's so amazing about this parable. This parable is not talking about being kind. It looks like it at first because that's where our heads are. But it's not talking about being kind. It's talking about a completely different way of looking at reality. So when Jesus told this story, and he's saying, so the kingdom of heaven is like a guy who throws a party, a ruler, a wealthy guy, and everybody knows they're invited. All the right people, all the usual suspects, they know they're supposed to be there. They know that. They've always gone to these parties. They've essentially, metaphorically speaking, they've always been at the high places. The parable right before this was about those people struggling to get to the high places of honor at the table. It was another parable about the folks who want to be next to the host. And Jesus threw it upside down there and said, yeah, good. But that's not the kingdom. The kingdom is about the people sitting at the other end. So if you want to be a part of that, go sit at the other end. It just didn't make sense. And this one doesn't make sense. All the usual people were invited, and then they suddenly decide not to. Why wouldn't they come? So they have excuses, and they're not illegitimate excuses. I mean, a wedding is a significant community event. A wedding is a very important event. Buying property is a very powerful, significant thing. Buying oxen. I mean, all of these things were legitimate, but they still weren't getting something. The idea that this party, this celebration, this kingdom is not about the way in which you normally see things. And they missed the point. And so Jesus, or the host says, so go out to the far side, go out to the area just outside the palace, for example, outside the mansion or wherever the hosting was having his party, and then invite the poorer people, invite the injured people, invite the folks struggling, perhaps the servant class. Go to the next caste down the line. Invite those people. Servants said, Master, we've already done that, so we still got room. And then he says something really incredible. He says, well, then just go beyond the walls and invite all those people. The enemy, the folks that don't even belong in Judaism. Invite those people at the highways. That's what he's saying. Now, anybody hearing that story, depending on which side of it, I've told a story about the guy that goes in the bar and he's asking, he says every last Republican is an idiot, a horse's rear end, and they all beat him up. And then he comes back and says every last Democrat is a horse's rear end, and they beat him up again. And he's like, who are these people? And they say it's horse country. It's like that. It's like if you're telling the joke and it's pointing your finger at those people, you'd get it. But the wrong people are laughing at this joke. Because the wealthier or the powerful or the elite or the Pharisees or the Pharisaic class, they don't think it's funny. But the ones that are hearing it that have always been excluded are scratching their heads going, this doesn't make sense. And it's actually quite funny. They are the ones that are supposed to be included in this event. It's kind of a radical banquet. This celebration becomes sort of like the great equalizer. Even as we say this meal that we're going to have today is the great equalizer. It's this idea that things are completely turned upside down. I had this experience of, I watched this video. I've talked about Krista Tippett in here lots of times. Some of you all watch or get the Krista Tippett blog. It's called Brain Pickings. If you don't get it, I've recommended it. Lynn and I both are big fans of it. I think Sharm's a big fan of it. It's a great literary, political, philosophical, religious blog that just is so insightful, covers lots of territory. She did something that kind of frustrated me for the first time. I almost want to write her because I contribute to it. I use it so much, I actually contribute to it, And I read a post that she had a couple of weeks ago about what is community. That's why I asked you guys to ask each other, what does community mean to you? Beautiful little slick 2-minute video about what is the meaning of community. Had all of these beautiful people, been at different ages, different ethnic backgrounds, all of them happy. And they were describing community. It's a place where I feel people are like me. I have people who think like me. It's where I'm with like-minded people. And then another one said, it's a wonderful place where there's great restaurants to go and eat because I like certain kinds of food. I mean, for me, it would have a sushi bar right down the street, and then a coffee bar where the baristas know my name. And so everything was like that. It would be a place where I could walk my dog. And after about 15 of these voices going back and forth, it was very clear. It would look like some of our favorite communities here in Fort Worth, right? Or if you go over to Dallas and you go over to the McKinney area, for example, or if you go over to Fairmont and you go over up and down Magnolia, or if you go down into the 7th Street corridor, these wonderful neighborhoods that have these great restaurants and all these people, and it's just so pretty and it's so fun and it's so outdoorsy and we love it. It makes us feel so good, right? And that's not at all what Jesus is talking about. As much as we like those communities, and as much as that kind of community may even be great for economy, so to speak, it's not at all what this community is. In fact, the sad truth is that what's really happening here, when it's all about me, is that we run this risk of buying right into the kind of polarity that's so much a part of our reality now. I'll say that again. When we get so easily caught up in what makes us happy, and I don't want to demean that, that's important, but when we get so caught up in that short-arm syndrome, we're buying into a polarization that's been ingrained and continues to get deeper and deeper and deeper in our reality. And it's challenging. And then we end up with these kind of ironies, where even Mr. Rogers is smiling and saying, "You're not invited." I mean, that's just not right. If anybody loves us, it's Mr. Rogers, right? If we know we can go anywhere and be loved by anybody, whoever we are, we know it's Mr. Rogers. Really, right? How many of you can sing along with me? It's a wonderful day in the neighborhood, a beautiful day in the neighborhood, would you be? You know that better than Jesus loves me. Or at least as well as Jesus loves me. Could you be mine? Would you be mine? Won't you be my? You're not invited. Could you hear that? He comes on the show opens up and he just says, "I'm sorry, you're not invited. Bye-bye." That's the kind of thinking. Community is so often thought of in that way, that it's all about us. And it's not a bad thing, because we do need communities where we feel safe. We do need communities where we feel like we can roam around and find people that we can get along with. But that's the challenge. That's what's so laughable and radical about this story, is because this story is saying that something else is actually happening here. This story is more like this. Hey, who's coming to dinner? Hillary, Donald, Bernie. Oh, Francis. And Jesus, he's got the wine. So I'm not going to ask who went to the Trump rally or who went to the Hillary gathering. But imagine you were at the Trump rally and you said, "Hey, why isn't Bernie here? Let's bring Bernie over. Let's bring all his buddies." Right? I'm sure they'd be welcome, right? You go to the Hillary rally and you say, "Let's bring Trump over here. We'd love to have Trump join into the party." It's just not going to work. And that's the problem. As long as we think that, we're all still living with short-arm syndrome. We're all still living with the idea of what's the difference between heaven and hell? Well, it's the people, and we're kind of not really helping matters. It's a challenge to get our heads around this idea of how do we hold all of this diversity in one place? What does the kingdom really look like? So here's one of my favorite places to hang out. You guys like to hang out here? Some of y'all know this place. Clear Fork Bend, Trinity River, great little food park. Love that place. Get yourself a nice sandwich. Get some of the I forget what they call it now, the Mexican food. That they've got that booth there. I think there's a Greek one there. Anyway, and maybe get a nice beer, sit back, enjoy the company. You're there with some friends. That's community, right? But then here's the weird thing. That's the plaza in Fortín de las Flores, which is just south of Tampico. I visited there a couple of years ago, and there was a wonderful article about the folks here in Fortín. It's a wonderful tourist town. They've got I'm forgetting now, Dwayne, what they call that when you jump off the cliffs with a kite. What do you call that? Paragliding. Yes, paragliding. They have a great picture online of people doing that crazy thing that you like to do, where it's just jumping from high spots, and it's a really popular place. Here's what's happening on the other side of the tracks. Just behind the trees along one of the back roads where they have a lot of those little shacks that are kind of set up almost like the food trucks, only people set them up themselves because they're providing whatever food they can cook up, and they're feeding the immigrants who are making their way from Central America and trying to get into the United States. Now, I'm not going to talk politics about immigration policy in here. I'm not even going to go there. That's not my point. My point is what does it mean to be community? What does it mean to be community? And so you ask people there who are just bringing out food and cooking. They're all poor to middle class at best, certainly by our standards at very best. And they're just bringing out food because they notice that there's hundreds and hundreds of people coming up and down those tracks that are many of whom are dying. Many of whom are always hungry or cold. And so what do you do when somebody's hungry? You feed them. I mean, really? You turn your back on somebody that's hungry? You just feed them. They're not particularly church members. Some of them are. And not everybody in 14 actually agrees with this, but the majority of people do. The article that was in Christian Century was shocking at how many of these folks just turn out and decide, yeah, we're just going to make some food up. Whatever we're making up that day, we're just going to take over and give them to the train. A lot of non-perishable stuff too. But that's community. I was sitting with a guy at Sneem International Festival in Ireland. It's a storytelling festival. I've told you all about this time before when I was there a couple of years ago. And it was a fascinating experience. And as I joked with you once before, I did 3 performances at night, and I always got different responses depending on what I told. If I told traditional material, like good old Texas tall tales, then a lot of the elderly members that were in the group out there were like 300 in the audience. They'd come up and they'd say, "Mr. McDermott, we'd like to buy you a pint." And I would have a great time, and I'd sit down with them, and they'd have this wonderful talk to tell us more about Texas and cowboys and Indians and such. And I would just, they would love the tradition. The next night, I did that story that I've done in here in the past where I talk about growing up and wanting to be a rock star, and I end up playing Born to Be Wild on electric ukulele. And it just is crazy, and here I am rocking out on a distorted ukulele and singing Born to Be Wild, and a lot of the traditional people out there were looking at each other like this and looking up at me, and I had like a half a dozen young adult guys come up and say, "I'd like to buy you a pint tonight." And so it was this kind of difference between the groups. But one night, they both kind of came up, and I ended up sitting down with this gentleman who was probably 70, and then this other fellow who was probably in his late 30s, maybe 40, with his wife. And it was clear from their accent or their brogue that one of them was from Northern Ireland, and then the older fellow was more traditional. He was from the Republic. He was from the south part of it. And he kind of smiled, and he looked at me, and he said, "I love what you tell, but your brogue is only half bad." And so I kind of said, "Thank you." I think that's a compliment, I think. And they got into talking about the stories, but inevitably it trickled into something uncomfortable. Because if you've been to Ireland and if you sit around talking to people who are on either side of the border, it's going to inevitably fall back into the old bitter roots, the old bitter ways of thinking. And I hadn't been into it more than about 40 minutes when the younger guy looked over at the older guy, and it came out of nowhere, and he says, "Your people abandoned us." And I thought, yikes, I don't want to be here. I mean, this is an awkward place. And the older guy kind of took a sip, and he looked at him, and he said, "We didn't abandon you. You made bad choices." And it went back and forth until it was getting pretty heated. The people in the north often claiming that the people in the south turned their heads, looked the other way as the English came in and did more and more and more overtaking and more oppressiveness and such. Even though a lot of what was going on was illegal, they still hold this bitterness towards the people in the south. The south still hold this prejudice and opinionatedness towards the people in the north. This table was representing the conflict between those two people when the wife, she said, "Can we stop? We have this company here." And then she looked at me, and I smiled, and I said, "Maybe I just need to go." And she said, "No," she said, "I want to hear something." And she looked at the older guy, and she said, "I want you to tell me who you know that was in the Troubles. Personally, who you know. Just tell me. I just want to know." And I don't know if this woman was some gifted saint or if she was just a gentle spirit, but the older guy talked about his brother who died in an early conflict. And she just asked questions. She didn't make any judgments, and she didn't ask for any opinions. She just said, "Thank you for sharing that." And then she asked her husband to share the same thing, and he shared some of his experiences. And before you know it, they were talking about the challenges and the pains and the losses and the difficulty and just the sheer wrongness of the whole reality. And the fact is that they didn't leave that table with this sense of which we're going to be best buddies now. They weren't even close. But where they had moved is they had finally moved toward an open door, towards some reconciliation. But it had to begin with listening. It had to begin with just being present. The old African proverb that says, "You can't really hate someone whose story you know." Well, sure, you can dislike them. Sure, they can scare you at times. Sure, you can completely disagree with them. But if you begin to share your story with one another and begin hearing one another's story, you're going to find there's something much more common between all of us, among all of us. Something that this parable suggests to us at being at the banquet. There are lots of ways to feed people across the table, and reaching out with food is certainly one of them. But a lot of times, just simply reaching out with presence, just simply being present to one another is a powerful food that we all long for. Just that willingness to listen. And there's a third one that I want to offer up to you today that I hope you'll leave with as well. Just being here in this room is a profound, powerful gift that we give to one another. And I don't think about it very often, and maybe you do. But I know for a fact that when I was feeling really challenged and difficult and ran through some really hard times in our lives with dealing with some issues in our family, that the very fact there were people present in my life, I didn't have to talk to them. I didn't have to tell them that I need your help. I mean, I did at times, but I didn't have to say, I need you to help me solve this. I just knew that they were people present. And it was such an amazing comfort to let me know my reality would continue. I could survive. Just being here is a gift to one another. It's a shared reality, this idea of community. There are so many ways we can get rid of this short-arm syndrome, and we can begin to open up to what really the kingdom is about. Openness, compassion, attentiveness, just being present. It's this opportunity to recognize the challenges, the differences, the Trumps, the Bernies, and somehow go, let's try to hold this. Let's try to hold this. That's what the banquet's all about. Amen.